Hello everyone. So recently I have been catching some flack because you guys have made it obvious to me that I start off all my homework videos almost exactly the same. Something on the lines of, hello everyone, alrighty, let's get started or let's get to it. So this time I'm gonna say, oh, what is the phrase? What they do? What it do? I believe that's a term used to describe hello. So regardless what it do, let's get to it. We are still talking about inflation. Alright, so our LEQ for this video is only one. What are the functions and differences between CPI and PPI? Two acronyms you are about to learn. Now, these next two slides are simply a review from the prior video. Please remember that inflation is a rise in the average price of goods and services in the macro economy. Remember guys, we're talking big scale here. If the cost of bananas goes up, we can't say there's inflation. However, if the cost of a lot of agricultural products goes up, if most of the groceries in the grocery store goes up, we can say we are in a period of inflation. Now remember, the reason we have to study inflation is because it can skew GDP. Simply saying GDP goes up, oh, that's great. But is GDP really going up if only things are more expensive? Remember, GDP doesn't care about price, so to speak. It cares about production. Remember the example in the prior night's video. In the year 2014, if a pair of Jordans cost $250, in the year 2015, a pair cost $300, well, the net product is still only one pair of Jordans. So GDP, without taking inflation into consideration, can be misleading. So remember, when we're talking about inflation, we're talking about the purchasing power of money. That is your dollar really worth a dollar? So $20 in 1972 could have bought you so many items. $20 in 1982 could have bought you so many items, so on and so forth. So inflation must be taken into account. So there are two tools that economists use to take inflation into account. These two tools are CPI and PPI. They are used to measure inflation. So you can see here on the same graph, we chart CPI versus PPI. Now, a few things I want to point out to you guys. Again, you do not yet know what these are. The late 1980s was a period of rapid inflation. As you can see, prices were going up exponentially. If you ask any economist what's the most recent boom we have had, the early to mid to even late 1990s, so the entire decade of the 1990s was a great period of expansion and peak. So if you think of the business cycle, it was a boom time for the economy. Inflation was overall going down during this period on both the CPI and PPI. Now fast forward to where we are closer to nowadays. Yes, inflation is back on the rise. That is, prices overall are going up. So what is CPI? CPI stands for the Consumer Price Index. So consumer, think about you and I, think about households. CPI measures the change of price over time of a specific group of goods and services that are used by the average household. A key word there is average. So I'm about to share with you some of the products that are included in the CPI. Please do not say, we don't buy that every week, or we don't buy that every month. Well, on average, the average American does. So these average items are included. So the CPI is released every single month, and it's used to keep track of inflation. Right now, I would encourage you to pause this video and Google search CPI for this particular month and see what comes up. It is reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, here's what the CPI actually measures. It measures a market basket. Again, this is a metaphor. So the market basket is a representative group of goods and services that are used to compute CPI. It includes about 80,000. So yeah, it's pretty darn accurate. That's a lot of stuff to measure. Goods and services under general categories such as food, housing, transportation, apparel, education, recreation, medical care, and personal care. In other words, what does the average American spend their money on? That's what CPI measures. No, it does not measure all 500 billion things we could buy, potentially. It averages the averages of what we can potentially buy. This basket that economists use, it's updated about every 10 years to reflect more current spending patterns. For example, in the 1990s, cell phone service was considered a luxury and not many people had it, and it was not included in the CPI. However, since the year 2000, yes, cell phone service has been included in CPI. Now here's a graph of what's included in the Consumer Price Index. So if you look to the right, these are basically the categories that most consumers spend their money on. Housing includes things like mortgages and rent. Transportation includes gas as well as oil changes, as well as buying new tires. Food and beverages, that might include going out to eat. Medical care, how much does the average doctor's visit cost? Recreation, how much does the average movie ticket cost? Education and communication, how much, again, think about the cell phone bill, that's under communication. And apparel, how much does the average pair of Jordans cost? So again, they do not measure every pair of shoes and every shirt under apparel, but they pick some very standard brands and they measure those prices. Now, when you look at CPI, if you were to Google search, and we'll be doing this in class, the CPI for this current month, you're going to see the CPI is up 14%. Okay, 14% from what? From yesterday? From this period of time? CPI is always measured against a base year. So the current base year, the current standard of reference, check this out. This is interesting. It's from the 1980s. So what economists did, they took the average price of this market basket for 3 years, to get a really accurate measure, for 3 years, from the early to mid 1980s, and set that as, okay, this is going to be our average. All these comparisons we make, inflation is up, inflation is down, so on and so forth, they are going to base it off of that particular period of time. Now, just to give you guys an example, the CPI for this representative basket of goods, keep in mind it's about 80,000 different goods. A representative sample has risen from $10 to $11.65 as of 2015. Now, that $1.65 may not seem like a lot, but do not forget, we are talking about over the course of an entire year what millions of Americans are spending their money on. That $1.65 increase represents hundreds of billions of dollars of inflation since the 1980s. So we're going to change gears now and talk about the PPI. So we just got to talk about CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. We are not talking about the Producer Price Index. Once again, we are looking at the exact same issue, inflation, from a different perspective. So CPI looks at inflation from the consumer perspective. PPI looks at inflation from the producer perspective. So just like CPI, again, PPI is very similar. It measures the change in price over time in the United States that producers charge for their goods and services. So not so much what you and I are buying, but what producers charge for their goods and services. The primary difference is that PPI measures the suppliers of suppliers. So think about wholesalers or manufacturers. Now, PPI does measure how much Macy's charges for shoes, for example, but it also measures how much did Macy's have to pay for those shoes. Whichever company Macy's got those shoes from, how much did that company have to pay for the factors of production to acquire those shoes? So PPI measures how much is being charged from like the most basic factors of production. For example, if I were to buy a new juicer for Jared's Juice Bar, okay, I paid $300 for it. Well, how much did the company that I bought that juicer from have to pay to acquire the factors of production necessary to produce that juicer? Now, just like CPI has a basket of goods, the basket of goods in PPI are mining. Think about land, all the steel and diamonds and salt and sand used and stuff. Manufacturing and agriculture are the chief components of PPI. Now, one thing you should know is that PPI usually increases before CPI. That is, PPI is a predictor of CPI. Let's do an example. Let's pick on an apple farmer today. So let's say in this particular year, the apple farmers worldwide have a weak harvest because of a drought. So because of that shortage, you guys have done Unit 2, you know about supply and demand. When there is a shortage, prices go up. Okay, so these apple farmers now have to charge more to Publix, to Whole Foods, to Walmart, to a bakery. Whoever buys their apples, they have to charge more. Okay, so the PPI would capture that. The PPI says, okay, apple farmers are charging more. Well, what comes next? If a bakery that makes apple pies is paying more for apples, well, eventually they are going to have to raise the price of their apple pies. Once the price of apple pies raises, that is then captured by the CPI, generally a month or two later. All right, so here's our LEQ review. Our LEQ were the functions and differences between CPI and PPI. So remember, CPI is the consumer price index. PPI is the producer price index. CPI has to deal with a hypothetical basket of goods and how much it has changed since the early 1980s. PPI is the exact same thing, a hypothetical basket of goods, but it measures inflation from the producer's perspective. All right, guys, thank you for watching this video. Oh, wait. I need to come up with a different ending. People have been saying I say this too much. Done.